Well, once again, apparently I'm a very scary person. I'm a very scary person, it turns out, because a lot of people watch shows like this one. People watch this show, people listen to this show, people watch clips of me saying things on the YouTubes. And according to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is essentially the NPR of Canada, this is a state-funded enterprise, a left-wing state-funded enterprise in Canada. Apparently, all of my speech should probably be banned because, after all, people might watch my stuff. And then there's an off chance that they might then see even worse stuff. And then that might lead them down a rabbit hole to the super, super bad stuff. There's an entire article on the CBC website titled, "It's a Slippery Slope, How Young Men Fall into Online Radicalization." Well, by the way, it is fun to watch how the left treats slippery slope arguments when they're coming from their side. When the right says, if you go along with civil unions, eventually it'll be gay marriage. And if you go along with gay marriage, eventually it'll be attempting to force people to accept same-sex marriage in religious schools. Then that's a slippery slope we cannot abide, even if the slippery slope completely materializes. But apparently, it is fully okay to make a slippery slope argument when I say something that is not extreme. It's possible to make the argument that somebody might view that and then see something that's a little more extreme than that, and eventually they end up being a Nazi. This is the case the CBC is about to make. Quote, Reed Brown remembers the first time he got sucked in by the algorithm. He was just 13, watching videos after school when YouTube started pushing him to controversial content. As time went on, the videos became increasingly extreme, says Brown, now 21. It started out pretty benign, he recalls. You're watching something about teen fashion, and then the next thing you know, the algorithm would push you to a Ben Shapiro video. Oh, no. Though Shapiro describes himself as a conservative political commentator, his views are controversial. Is there another way to describe me other than as a political commentator who is conservative? Like, is there another description that is more apt? What they want to say here, of course, is that I'm alt-right. The problem is that people in the media, including The Economist, have attempted to call me alt-right before, and we have then threatened them with legal action because the alt-right hates my guts, and I've ripped the alt-right routinely, doing full speeches about the alt-right, and so they've had to retract such statements. So instead, they say, well, I call myself conservative, but you know what they would call me? They would call me an extremist, which goes to show you that if they call me an extremist, you're definitely an extremist as well. Though Shapiro describes himself as a conservative political commentator, his views are controversial. Some are outright discriminatory. Wow, I didn't know that. Well, what are my discriminatory views? It seems to me that I've always been of the viewpoint that, for example, people should be treated as individuals, not based on their race or their religion. I thought that was like basic to my worldview, actually. But it turns out, according to the CBC, that some of my views are outright discriminatory. He suggested, for example, that transgender people suffer from a mental disorder. Oh, you mean me and the American Psychiatric Association? Like in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, it literally labels gender dysphoria a mental disorder because it used to be called gender identity disorder. You mean that? So it's now discriminatory to say that people who have gender dysphoria, in fact, suffer from a mental disorder, which they clearly do since it is labeled as such in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as politicized and left-wing as the DSM is. But apparently that's discriminatory, guys. We have to pretend that men who say they are women are actually suffering from some sort of mind-body misalignment. And the problem is with their body. So if we just chop off some body parts, then magically they're a woman because their brain is the brain of a woman. Now, you might have to have a mental disorder to believe that, but that's actually not science. But if I say that, it's apparently discriminatory. Says the CBC, Shapiro has a combined 9.4 million subscribers and followers on YouTube and Twitter, many of whom are young people. No, not the youths, not the youths, like Brown was when he got pushed in Shapiro's direction. Well, Shapiro is not affiliated with any hate group. Experts, the ever-present experts in media, gender studies, and radicalization of young men say the commentator's content is prevalent in online extremist communities. So they're saying openly, there's no evidence that I'm affiliated with a hate group because I'm not affiliated with a hate group, and they have no evidence of it because it doesn't exist. But they do have experts. And who are these experts? Who are these massively influential, important, and very expert experts? Who are they? They are experts in media. Wow. How do you even get that hat? How do you earn the expert in media hat? Do you go to like a journalisming program at a top university taught by other professors who have failed out of the media because they weren't able to hold a job, and now they are academics, and all they do all day long is talk about the media? But they don't actually have an audience like we do here on this show. They just sit at an Ivy League boardroom and discuss their expertise in front of students. Is that what they do? They're experts, by the way, in gender studies. Ooh. Well, experts in gender studies. That must mean that they believe a bunch of crap that isn't true, but then they get to churn out little versions of themselves who then become the professors, because you can't actually get a real job. If you major in gender studies, you ain't getting a real job doing anything. That is not a major that qualifies you for anything except being a professor in gender studies. It is a fully self-perpetuating cycle of uselessness. Also, experts in the radicalization of young men. So I assume these are people who study, like, Islamic terror, for example. But no, actually, it just turns out that radicalization of young men just means that people, they don't like what I say. The exposure to controversial and increasingly harmful views. Harmful. This is the key word for the left. Harmful. As we will see, this is how you criminalize speech. The way that you criminalize speech is you say, speech is harmful because if my feelings are hurt, you have harmed me. You have aggressed against me, and thus you must be shut down. I mean, it's the equivalent of me like hitting you with a baseball bat or something. The exposure to controversial and increasingly harmful views about masculinity, the objectification of women, and the LGBT community has these same experts raising concern about how extremist far-right groups are using TikTok, YouTube, and other social media apps in a drip campaign to slowly radicalize vulnerable teens and young men. Ooh. Okay, so I just have a couple of questions about that particular paragraph. They say, the exposure to controversial views about what are my controversial views about masculinity? What are they? That men exist? I don't think that's particularly, that men should finish high school, get a job, get married, and take care of their kids without abandoning them? Is that the controversial view about masculinity? Is the controversial view about masculinity that men should be responsible husbands and fathers? What's controversial? If that's controversial, it's just because society is insane, not because what I'm saying is controversial. The objectification of women. That's a new one. I hadn't heard that one before. In case you didn't notice, I wear a funny hat. The hat is called a kippah. That kippah suggests that I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm trying to make this linkage for the CBC, a state-funded enterprise in Canada. And you know what the Orthodox Jews are not so big on is the objectification of women. We're not super big on that. I've been an outspoken anti-porn advocate since I was like 16 years old. I was an advocate and still am for virginity of both sexes until marriage. So I'm gonna need some evidence on the objectification of women front. By objectification of women, do you mean that I think that there are actual standards of beauty and that there are many people in popular culture who we have been told are supposed to be seen as beautiful who are not objectively beautiful? Obviously, that's true. Obviously, that's true. If you polled men on whether Lizzo is beautiful, and I say Lizzo is not, by any classical definition, a beautiful person, that does not mean that that is objectification of women. That just means that there is a standard called beauty, and it has meaning and content. Okay, that's not a particular controversial view, unless, again, you're an insane person. But they say that I have increasingly harmful views about LGBT community. Now, I assume that what they mean by this is that I say, as most societies have said for literally all human history, that the foundation of a successful society is man, woman, child. That heterosexual sex within marriage is the morally preferable form of sex in society. That all of human progeneration is rooted in it. That all of societal stability is founded upon it. And that when you get rid of the standard, that there is, in fact, a moral superiority to heterosexual sex within the confines of marriage. When you get rid of that, you end up destabilizing both reproduction and society itself. Again, this is basic natural law kind of stuff. Seems to be backed by a fair bit of evolutionary biology as well. This is not saying that the government should regulate the type of sex that people can have in the privacy of their own bedroom. It is to say that pretending that there is no level of moral superiority to your sex life is very, very silly when we apply moral superiority and inferiority scales to literally everything else you do, from the food that you eat to the clothes that you wear. So apparently that's very controversial as well. And that's really bad. The goal of the CBC piece, of course, is to get my content banned on social media. And so what they have to do here is that they can't actually say what about my views is so terrible. So instead what they do is they say, well, young people watch my stuff, and then they increasingly watch other people's stuff. And those other people's stuff is really bad. And then even worse stuff. Now, again, they'll never use this argument about, for example, marijuana and the fact that virtually everyone who does hard drugs originally started with marijuana. That argument was ruled out of bounds long ago. And we have to pretend now, by the way, that marijuana is not addictive. Marijuana is, in fact, addictive by all available data. We have to pretend all that stuff. But we're not allowed to make that argument with regard to a slippery slope on drugs. We're also not allowed to make the argument with regard to a slippery slope on pornography. If we say that people access porn and a subsection of the people who access that porn are going to access more and more extreme versions of porn up to and including violent porn, and that has an effect on people's souls and it makes them less sensitive toward women, you're not supposed to say that either. That's really bad. So again, slippery slope arguments only apply to the things that they want them to apply to, namely politics. According to the CBC, again, I can't get over the fact, if this were like a normal piece in a normal left-wing publication like Salon or something, but okay, fine, this is normal. This is a state-funded news report. It is a news report. It is not even a commentary report from the CBC. And as you'll see, this has broader ramifications for where we go as a civilization, because this piece is really the latest iteration of what Canada is doing, which is an attempt to crack down on free speech, particularly the free speech of people who believe in traditional ideas about marriage, for example. The videos Brown watched as an early teen were often misogynistic, he said, and it started to affect the way he thought and how he interacted with people at school. I remember repeating some sexist attitudes, things about the wage gap. Okay, so what have I said about the wage gap? Let's assume that he watched one of my videos. What did I say about the wage gap? I said the wage gap is a myth, that women do not earn less than men if they are equally qualified, if they've had equal amount of time in the workplace, if they're working the same jobs, if they've not taken time off to have kids. That is not sexist. That is statistical fact. Right now, women earn the majority of degrees in the United States in college. Women constitute the majority of people in law schools. I believe they now constitute the majority of people in medical schools as well. Right now, men are falling behind in the United States, not women. So apparently, if he said that, and that made him a sexist, right? Especially when I was hanging out with my guy friends, we were repeating all these things we were seeing on the internet, a lot of sexism and misogyny. The sexism and misogyny example, again, was saying that there is no wage gap. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.